intent can also have a really incredible impact when you're doing so knowing it's helping other people at the same time, because it's conversations people aren't often having.
Yeah, 100%. And there's a statistic in the world, and I may have said this when I was speaking at the Unstoppable Success Summit, but
Yeah.
at any given time, there are 75,000 people that need to hear your message specifically from you.
Yes.
And you can find those people just by sharing, just by being curious, by asking the right
Yeah.
questions. I really realized that a big shift for me in business and life and my brand growing was I stopped trying to be the most interesting person in the world and really focused on being the most interested person in
Yeah.
the world and asking the right questions and unlocking new things. And one of my favorite things as a podcaster is when a guest says, I've never talked about this before.
Yes.
Because that means, I'm on the right track, right? I'm
Yeah.
really headed down the right road. And so that was a huge shift for me. And obviously now as the podcast has grown and over 3.5 million downloads now, and it gets played in 100 countries every single week, I've really changed my approach a little bit as far as
Yeah.
saying, okay, now people are listening. They weren't at first. Now they're
Yeah.
listening. So I have to say, what do you guys want to
Right.
hear about? What do you guys want to learn?
Right.
And so we do that now too. But still, a lot of times, when I get to sit down with people I look up to and heroes of mine, I selfishly ask the questions that I would want to ask as well. So
Yeah.
it's all part of it.
Well, and I think that's a cool thing. I think last week I had Steven Scoggins on, which is where the venue host, and he's going to speak at my event later this year at the same venue. And I'm like, you know what? This conversation has gone right where I am right in this moment. So I'm just going to completely pretend like nobody is listening and ask you all the questions. But it also allows people to see you in a vulnerable lens. Like, you were grieving, you were curious, you were like, I'm just trying to breathe here, right? And self-development, that's a part of it. I was teaching at a experience this past weekend. It was a Christian Woodstock. Okay. So imagine that. It was like campers and RVs and tents and all the things minus the outfits. There was very different outfits at this one. And I was teaching, and one of the girls was like, raise her hand. She was maybe, I would say, young 20s, if that. And she said, I love hearing you talk about faith and business together. I've never heard anybody say that and talk about it like that before. But I'm still exploring. Like, I'm still trying to figure out who God is. How do I talk about self-development and open up about that conversation? I'm like, you do that. You literally just do that thing. So how would you say, for the person who's curious or the person who's like, I don't want to press play on a podcast and make this so like legitimized. I don't want people to know the inner workings of my brain. How has it been beneficial to you and supported your community in the process?
Yeah, I mean, it's been everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it changed my life, right? Like it's literally changed my life as far as, getting over the fear and doing it anyway, right? Now, I had a co-host for the first year. And
Right.
the reason I had a co-host was because I was nervous. I
Yeah.
was afraid. What if people judge me? Like, what if I do something dumb? What if I do something wrong? What if it
Yeah.
fails miserably and everybody looks at you and go, haha, another failure? And so I had a co-host from that standpoint. And honestly, the crazy part was when I asked him to take a step back after doing it for a year,
Yeah.
that's when it started to grow.
Wow.
And I realized that when you are living in your intention and moving through your purpose, your higher calling, whatever you want to call it, like that's when you're rewarded, right?
Yeah.
That's when the people show up. But it only happens when you're vulnerable.
Yeah.
It only happens when you're being your authentic self 100% of the time, because otherwise you're just a fraud, right? Now, there are plenty of people who are frauds who have made it because they found a system or a tactic or they bought their way in.
Yeah.
But for this guy from Reading, Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
like it took me being vulnerable to really make that impact. And I remember there was a moment in the first year of the podcast, I was thinking about shutting it down. 30, 40 people were downloading. I'm like, what am I doing? What's the point? It was a lot of work. I still had a day job at the time.
Yeah.
And I ended up getting a message on Facebook from somebody from Japan. And they said, because of your show, I decided not to take my life.
Come on.
And I remember the moment in the show and why he said this, because I had a friend who committed suicide. And his name was Tommy Page. He was actually a pop star in the 90s, which is really random. He was on an episode of Full House.
I love it. That's
But
awesome.
yeah, but he ended up taking his own life, and nobody knew he was sad or depressed or struggling.
Yeah.
And on the outside, he was so bubbly and loving, and everybody loved him. And that was not easy for me to share when I was having this conversation, but for whatever reason, I felt compelled to share it in the interview.
Yeah.
And it was that moment that saved that other person's life. And so, how selfish of me not to show up.
Yeah.
How selfish of me not to get uncomfortable and share stories like that.
Yeah.
Because it could save a life. And now I've gotten probably 5 or 6 messages like that throughout the 7 years of the show. And it's just, it's hard to hear that people are struggling like that, but at least I'm doing what I can to make a difference in the world, and specifically their world.
We always say here, and I'm sure it's been on a pulpit somewhere in some church, about you're blocking somebody else's blessing when you're not standing in your calling. And so to not be that block, and ultimately that block might just be you. Like, even if nobody listens to that episode, every single time I show up, I always tell people that I come open handed with my hands wide open, with the desire to be convicted, which is the kind of the odd side of that. But like, how can I grow? How can I be sharpened as a host? Like, I'm not here to just share you. I'm here for you to teach me something, right? Like, let me learn, let me be a better human. And I remember hearing you say, be more interested than interesting. And it actually, I think, shifted the entire dynamic of that event for people. Just that simple line, whether it's been heard or people have said it before, it's like, whoa, that's right. I am not here for me. I'm here to learn about other people. And it all is synchronized. It all goes together, and it always comes back to you. I'd love to hear from you as you stepped, because you mentioned that you had a full-time job. At what point did you step back into the entrepreneurial game, per se? And was podbrand.io the first thing that you did?
No. Podbrand's actually pretty new, actually.
Okay.
So
well, that's good, because I didn't know about it, and I'm like, come on, I've been a podcast for 5 years and I launched podcasts for people. This is bad. But I was excited nonetheless.
Yeah, it's a newer project that we're really working on, and
cool.
I'll get to why we formed it in the first place. But
yeah.
When I launched the show, again, I had no idea of it actually being a business. I didn't know that it could make money. I didn't realize what it could actually do. Like, keep in mind, 7.5 years ago, I would tell people I had a podcast, then we go, "What's a podcast?"
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's just such a different world now.
Yeah.
And so, and then now people roll their eyes and they go, "Oh, you have a podcast too?" Right?
Yeah, you're like, that guy. Mind you guys, he's like, I'm sure it's different stats now, but he's been like top 10, top 8 in the world. Okay. So it's not just like a Joe Schmo. I love Joe Schmo, though. I'm so proud of Joe Schmo.
Yeah, everybody, right? And so, it was just this crazy thing. And so I was like, well, how can I monetize this, and how can I leave my day job? And so I started a podcast production company. And that started to kind of make a little bit of money on the side, not enough for me to like leave my job. And so the universe gave it a little nod, and I got fired from my last job. And so found out later that I ended up getting fired because I intimidated the CEO somehow. I don't know if it was like
that sounds about right.
Yeah, because my podcast took off long before a business ever took off for me.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening was, and this was a big shift for me, I ended up going down to Florida and speaking at an event. And like, I was like broke. I was making good money in my career, but I was spending it too. Like, I was a bachelor. I was a 29-year-old bachelor, like whatever. And so I ended up going down to the speaking gig instead of paying my rent. And I ended up having a conversation with somebody, and what he told me changed my whole perspective about what business was and how money flows. I ended up making $22,000 in the next 3 weeks, and I've been a full-time entrepreneur ever since. Got into some coaching, and then started doing live events. So I host my own live events for entrepreneurs, both big and small, retreats and bigger things. And that was the second business that kind of came out of it. And then people started hiring me to speak. And it all kind of happened when it was supposed to happen.
Yeah.
But I always have a foot in podcasting, because I realized that this vehicle changed my life.
Yeah.
It fixed my outlook on life itself. It fixed my outlook on myself. It fixed my outlook on business and how to make money. Like, it's changed my life considerably.
Yeah.